Hi everyone, thanks for coming. I'm Dilara. I'm a postdoc at the University of Edinburgh, and this is our work with Yasemin Acar, where we investigate the security and privacy perceptions of Turkish startups developers. Okay, so why Turkish startup developers? So firstly, I think most of the developer studies do not focus solely on startups. So they do group people. When they do the research, they group big companies and small and middle enterprises and such. But I've never seen a study that's focused solely on startups. And on the other side, most of the developer studies also focuses on more like US, UK, or Europe. And there's limited work on other countries that have rising tech spaces, like Turkey is one of those countries where computer science degrees are ever popular. And Turkey shows one of the fastest growth in software engineering, according to GitHub. And the investments into the startup scene is increasing rapidly. And logistically, the Turkish market has the potential to access Europe, Asia, and the Middle East. So here are my research questions. We have three main research questions. The first of them is how the software developers define usability, security, and privacy in their own terms. Secondly, we look at how our usability, security, and privacy are integrated into development cycles of their startup companies. And thirdly, we look at what are the possible risks they are facing, or maybe the potential risks they can say about regarding security and privacy, and what are the steps they took or taken to mitigate these risks. So to do that, we also conducted 16 semi-structured interviews with Turkish startup developers. We recruited participants from social media platforms, dedicated Slack groups for Turkish developers, but we mostly recruited our participants from Upwork, which is like a freelancer recruitment platform, but we ensured that they were also working in a startup currently or was working in a startup in the last 2 months. We had mostly bachelor's degrees, and we had software developers, team leads, and CTOs and co-founders, but all these people were highly in the development cycle. Mostly these companies were mostly less than 10 people, and most of them were doing a business-to-business model. Oh yeah, when asked, half of the companies said they were already providing services abroad, mostly probably Europe, and then the other half said they have plans to in the future. So first question, we asked participants to define security, privacy, and usability in their own terms. Security defined as preventing unauthorized access, data protection, and being trustworthy as a company. And when we ask about privacy, we get similar definitions about preventing unauthorized access, but we also had things about not sharing data with third parties and data minimization. For usability, I think everyone had better time trying to define usability. They were more easy. I think they more easily define usability more than security and privacy. Yeah, and then they talked about expected behavior, fulfilling the purpose, and ease of use. And we asked about, secondly, how is security, privacy, and usability is integrated to their development life cycles. And we saw that functional requirements are prioritized. And even one of the participants said that if a startup says they consider security from the start, and they are not a security-focused startup, they are lying. And yeah. And then they said that customers and regulations derive the integration of security in the more mature stages after a minimum viable product is done. Similar with privacy, but there were mentions of KVKK, which I should mention is the Turkish Personal Data Protection Guidelines, which actually came effective before GDPR. Maybe you're familiar with GDPR, is the European Personal Data Protection Law. GDPR was drafted earlier, and then Turkish government, I think, used it as kind of like a draft and put it effectively on 2016, which GDPR came to effect in 2018. And then we saw that usability is more integrated from the start than security and privacy, and user feedback is used to improve usability. And lastly, in the third question, we asked about what security and privacy risks do you face, and usability risks, basically, do you face in your job? And we didn't want them to disclose any I guess sensitive information, so they were free to say about their own companies' risks, or maybe some potential risk they see as users themselves, or yeah. And then they usually talked about data leaks of collected personal data for security and also for privacy. And for security, they talked about malicious attackers from outside and third-party library integration, and then the vulnerabilities of third-party libraries. And for privacy, they again talked about data minimization, ineffective data minimization, where they collect more data than they need for their product, and then they have the more risk of leaking that. And then for usability, they talked about backward compatibility and generational differences. We had a really interesting quotation about how generation Z is now more focused, they do prefer touching screens more than mouses, and that becomes a struggle for a small startup company. And then we asked, who do you think would be responsible for these risks that you stated? And most of the participants did hold themselves responsible as developers. The most popular answer was that it's shared between multiple parties. And one of them said only users were responsible, but they had a business-to-business model, so they weren't, I think, holding the end users responsible. And then one of them called for a supra-state organization, how World Health Organization works. Maybe there could be one organization that kind of regulates the security and privacy risks and, I guess, procedures. And then we asked the steps to mitigate the risks, and they stated developers should have security and privacy in mind from the start, and they should have a growth mindset and continuously improve themselves. And for companies, they talked about employing security teams, providing sufficient funds, and maybe having clear guidelines and from the start, make sure to say to your developers that, look, we are prioritizing security and privacy. Here are our guidelines. You need to make yourself familiar before you start working with us, or yeah. And so actually most of the findings, when we compare to previous research on developer studies, are in line, but we had some specific remarks that may apply to Turkey according to our participants. So they talked about lack of hierarchy in startups, and consider that most of the companies were less than 10 people. Probably they worked in the same room, and they were able to say, "Hey, CEO, can you look at this?" And they were I guess they were able to do that, and they would help each other. And the roles were not defined, so developers would be testers, and yeah. And then data leaks were the most common, discussed things. Also, disclaimer, this was in fall 2021, and it was just after there was a really big data leak from a food delivery company, where I think where is the most popular one. I'm not sure the total user, but probably in the scales of 50 million or something. And that's why maybe people are talking more about the data leaks, and they mentioned heavy sanctions for data leaks. So they say that KVKK is, the Turkish one, is enforced after leaks happen, and it can break a company. So they were really wary about the security and privacy leaks. And then, but as users, they had mistrust towards companies. So, and then when they compared GDPR and KVKK, they had the I guess the impression that KVKK it works after data leaks happen, but GDPR makes sure that these protections are in place before you start your company. So we had some recommendations in the paper. We have more in the paper. But resulting from our findings, we give recommendations to companies, developers, and researchers. We say that there should be sufficient funds and hiring security and privacy experts by companies, and developers should consider security and privacy as design issues from the start. And the security and privacy concept should be, as researchers and educators, we should introduce these concepts early in the curriculum, maybe in the undergraduate, because you see that most of the people were in bachelor's degrees. And usually in Turkey, I'm not sure about in US or in other countries, but usually these classes come as like specialized courses for postgraduates. And we say introduce more diverse participant pools by researchers and accessible guidelines by companies and regulators. So as a conclusion, we gave insights into Turkish startup developer perceptions of security and privacy. We see that customers, resources, and government regulations mainly dictate how security and privacy is integrated. Usability is easier to define compared to security and privacy. And security and privacy was really hard for our participants to differentiate, and they were always like intertwined. And we have lots of other things like developer pipeline, third-party integration, important, like what are the important factors they consider for development, and etc. And you can see that in our paper here in the QR code. And thank you.
All right, great talk. Any questions? So maybe I can kick off one. I think in your interview, it seems like you talked to both like CTOs as well as developers. I'm curious if you noticed different mindsets, especially because the startup is so small. Like you said, like there's less barriers.
Yeah.
I'm curious if there's differences there.
Well, there was only one CTO, and that was 2-people company, and the other one was the CEO. So I guess, and he was doing all the work. So actually, we have like we were asking lots of questions about. What about peer review? And he was like really like sad about it. Like, I wish I had some person to like do peer review with. I'm like, I'm sorry, but yeah. But this CTO was, I think, like I didn't have like anywhere to compare, like because we had 16 people. But this CTO was kind of like really responsible, and I think he mentioned reading KVKK before, and it's like a huge guidelines, and I think he read it back to back. I was like really impressed. Yeah.
Thank you.
So you mentioned you asked for the responsibility. Who do you think is responsible? And many of them said that different parties are responsible, which is usually an answer that nobody is responsible.
Yeah, that can be also a thing, right? Like when we ask about them, who do you think are responsible? They were like, but I kind of, this is maybe not scientific, but from the interviews, I did the interviews, and from I think the impression I get was like they were holding themselves definitely responsible. But you're right, it can fall through the cracks, right? There's no, like we also ask about like questions that's actually like in the paper about like, do you have any like one specific person or a team responsible for privacy and security in your group? And usually it was no. The answer was no for security, and maybe they had security teams for some, but for privacy it was like much less. But yeah, I guess you're right. I didn't like further probe into like, do you really hold yourself responsible? But yeah.
Thanks.
All right, great. So let's thank the speaker.
Thank you.